Welcome back. The Dark Night of the Soul is not as dark as it seems. It ends with light, and some people would say that the Dark Night of the Soul is the context or the thing that God is using to shed more light upon one's life. So, Dr. Paulien, you said I didn't mean to, that I've kind of triggered some sort of self-reflection on your own experience, Christian experience, life journey as a scholar, as a minister of the gospel. So,
well, all the years that I've taught stages of faith, no one ever asked me that question. You tell me about your dark night, and if they had, I wouldn't have been prepared to answer it. But you gave me a chance to think about that, and
yes.
it was a good learning experience.
What can you share with us about that learning experience of yours?
Well, in a real sense, a common denominator I found in all of my dark experiences was a certain humbling. They were humbling to me, and so when I took that lens to look at my life, I realized that long before the dark night of the soul in my life, there were humbling experiences where God was shaping me and changing me and growing me, etc. When I was young, growing up, I grew up in the faith. I grew up in a Seventh-day Adventist home. I was a very earnest, sort of a strange child. I read through Uncle Arthur's Bible stories at least 10 times before I was 10 years old. I read through much of the writings of Ellen G. White, who's a really complex, religious thinker. Read through most of her stuff, by the time I was a teenager. So I was kind of a strange child in many ways. I was very earnest, very sincere, very legalistic, very perfection driven, etc. And so even before the dark night of the soul, God had to challenge me as I was going through college and beginning to prepare for ministry, etc. God challenged me in a number of ways. And the first one that really comes to mind was around 1970, and it had to do with issues related to race. I grew up in New York City, and New York City has always been a very diverse place, and it's both a strength and a challenge in New York City. And I thought I was pretty good in that area. I went to a high school that was about 1/3 white, 1/3 Hispanic, 1/3 black. So friends, all around the spectrum was pretty common. I joined a choir that was predominantly black as a teenager. I had a pretty good bass voice, and the choir was lacking at the bottom end. And I and a number of my friends, all 16, 17 years old, joined this traveling choir. And the director was now famous, I would say, Jan Robertson, African American director, amazing human being. And this was during the civil rights movement, and so I was feeling pretty good about, myself being comfortable in a variety of places. And then I got to college, and there was this annoying kid there called Gregory Allen. So some people may know him. I think he's been at Oakwood College through the years, and he confronted me about the African American experience. He confronted me in the context of the civil rights movement, and we had a number of, challenging conversations, etc. As I got into the seminary and the pastorate, I tried to maintain some of those relationships, and sort of almost an amusing one is I ended up coaching a basketball team in New York City. That was, it was an African American league in Brooklyn. Different churches each had their teams, and this a friend of mine was pastor of a church. He didn't know anything about basketball, but he was coaching this team, and so he said, "Hey, help me do this," And after a couple of times, he stopped coming, and I just became the coach. And there, so you have the feeling like you're in a good place there. But I was at least open to reaching out to those that were different from me, probably part of the New York City experience. But God, at each stage that I thought I'd kind of made it, God was threw challenges at me that made me realize, no, there's still, some lagging things there. Um, People who are interested might look at my blogs on white supremacy,
Mm.
the long slog that God led me, realizing that there is an undercurrent in the world that favors people that look like me and doesn't favor people who don't. That's simply simply a fact. But what, excuse me, what do I do about that? That's something that's challenged me along the way. So that was perhaps the earliest thing I could say. Then around 1972, I met my future wife, and she was a new believer. In fact, she had walked into the church 6 weeks before I arrived as associate pastor. And one day we were at camp meeting, and she just said, she says, I need to be baptized again. And I'm kind of like, why? She was baptized a couple of weeks before.
Mhm.
She says, well, there's things I didn't tell the pastor. So we went for a long walk and found a rock in the middle of the wilderness overlooking a lake and some mountains and so on, a very lovely sight. And she unloaded a tale, of challenging experiences and things that she'd done as a teenager and so forth. And the challenge was, how do I bring her to Christ? She'd gone through the motions of baptism and joining the church and so on, but truly a life commitment to Christ. And I didn't know, because I'd never taught anybody that. I'd never led anybody to Christ. I'd never experienced that aha moment. And so I just plunged in, saying things that I had been taught, etc. But suddenly it sunk into her that God forgives, that whole past is gone in Jesus Christ. And the joy in her face was incredible. And at that moment, the lightning flashed, thunder rolled, and a downpour came in. And we were a long way from shelter. And downpour began, and we were just soaked to the bone almost instantly. And she looked at me with shining eyes and she said, I'm being baptized again. And that moment, I finally figured, I'd been a pastor now for a few weeks at least, and had played pastor in college for several years, but I'd never had that experience before. And so God used my meeting with that young lady to show me how it works. And by the way, her story and my story intertwine a lot. And she can tell her own story. And I'm going to try to stay out of her story as much as I can in what I'm talking about here. But she has her own story of dark nights and things like that. So it began together on that occasion, 1972, a journey that we're now married over 50 years, and
That's amazing.
blessing of God.
Congratulations.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, so then I get to seminary, 1973, 4, 5, mid 1970s. A number of people well known in the Adventist Church were in my class, including one of the presidents of the church. So it was a great class. I was learning a lot of stuff at the seminary. But at the seminary, I realized even though I had gone through the motions with my wife, I didn't understand the gospel. I didn't understand, what righteousness by faith actually is. I didn't understand who God is in a real sense. And there was a huge dust up in the 1970s in the Adventist church over the relation between the distinctives of Adventism and the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at the seminary when outside of class, I was reading things, etc., that led me to question whether I really understood what the gospel is. And
You
the
had been
crisis,
successful with your wife. How can
yeah,
you say that you did not understand the gospel when you have been successful already?
well, you don't need to understand the gospel to experience it. That's the good news.
Yes.
If you're a pastor, it might help if you actually understood what it actually is. Uh, People who know nothing about the gospel can still grasp the idea that God loves and accepts them
Hmm.
and frees them from the burden of the past.
Hmm.
You don't have to have a lot of theological knowledge to have that experience. But anyway, it comes up to 1980, and that was a very fateful year, I think, for the Seventh day Adventist Church. And the person who was the most influential to leading me to Christ in a phone call said, "It's time for you to leave the Adventist Church. The Adventist Church has rejected the gospel as a body, and it's time for you to go. You cannot follow Christ and follow Adventism at the same time." Now, normally I wouldn't take such a challenge too seriously, except that this was the person who truly helped me to understand what the gospel is. And that was a personal crisis for me. And I remember lying face down on a wooden floor, hard wooden floor in Brooklyn, New York, pounding that floor and saying, "God, what do you want me to do?" It was a challenge at the very core of my being. And it's interesting that God spoke to me on that occasion, not in an audible voice, but it was as real as I'm talking to you now. The words were real, they were in my head. I knew it was God. And what God basically said was the disciples of Jesus never left Judaism.
Yes.
Luther never left the Catholic Church. Ellen White never left the Methodist Church. They were all thrown out.
Yes.
You see, they were discarded by their former understanding. And God said, "This is for me. It might not be for anybody listening, but this is for me." God said to me, "My mission for you is in the Adventist Church.
Mm.
Whether it understands you or whether it doesn't matter. That is my mission for you. I want you to speak the truth as you understand it. Don't speak to preserve your job. Don't speak to preserve your reputation or even your life. Tell the truth as you see it, not vindictively, not angrily or something. Simply bear it as a witness. And if they throw you out, that's my sign that I have something better in
Yes.
store for you." And that has been a guiding star for me all along the way. And I genuinely expected on that occasion that probably it wouldn't be long before I would get tossed. And I found out that when you speak honestly and openly, authentically, uh, Seventh day Adventists are hungry for truth. They're hungry to learn and grow. And only speaking honestly in that way, uh, more and more people said, "We need what you have to share. We need this openness. We need this authenticity." So stage three was never comfortable for me.
Mm.
Maybe that's fortunate. You see, when I was in this, what people would call the success stage, I was constantly being challenged in one way or another, such as on this occasion. Another one just a year after that is I was content in many ways with where I was, but then I went to a seminar on spiritual gifts, and the speaker was somebody called Bill Liversidge, and he was sharing on spiritual gifts, and I did some reflection, took some tests and stuff, and realized that three gifts above all seemed to be, strong in me. Was the gift of research,
Mm-hmm.
another was the gift of teaching,
Mm-hmm.
and the third was the gift of missionary. And the missionary gift doesn't mean you have to go overseas or anything. It simply means a person who's comfortable in settings different than yourself. And obviously, my New York experience, my African American experiences indicated that there was something in me that could walk in other shoes and feel very much at home in those places. So I looked at that and I said, research, teaching, missionary. Where in the Adventist church can you do all three? And it was only one place I could think of, and that
Yes.
was the seminary at Andrews University.
Yes.
But you don't just walk into the seminary and say, God had called me to teach here. No, there's a quote union card that if you want to teach at that level, you have to have a PhD.
Mm.
And so that was a whole nother journey with God. And so in 1981, I began making preparations to go to the seminary, and nobody was sponsoring me. It was something I'd have to do all on my own. And I had come to that conviction before Liversidge. That kind of solidified it, that this is really the right thing. But I came to that conviction a few years before, and my wife and I agreed together to save money for the day that we would go and get the doctorate. And we lived on $800 a month, which back then was a lot more money than it is today.
Yes.
But it was pretty skimpy back then. It was half of my pastoral salary at the time. And in Brooklyn, we once paid $650 for heating oil in January. The 1 month's heating oil was $650. So this was a huge challenge to do it. But we did it because we wanted to. We felt God was calling us to this. Well, just before we left, we came to realize that my wife was pregnant. And we were going to have a child, and the whole plan had been that when I was at seminary, she would work and put us through, and then we would see to family and those things afterward. Well, this upset the apple cart in a real sense. It was a joyful thing for her, but I was kind of like, okay, now what? And I realized, okay, probably the best thing is for me to stay in New York City and pastor for another year or two.
Mm.
And that way we could earn enough money to make it through the doctoral program, etc. So I went to my landlord, who was also my neighbor. We shared a duplex. They were both houses, but they had a wall in common
Yes.
between them, and a back porch. We could talk to each other on the back porch. There was just a little fence between us and our tiny backyards in Brooklyn. And we became really good friends those years in Brooklyn. And he studied and became a lawyer during that time. And so I said to him, Mike, we said that we were leaving, but I'd actually like to stay. And he said, well, he says, but I've already promised the house to another family, so we'd put it on the market that there's a rental property, and promised the house. But hey, I'm a lawyer. I can get out of this. There's nothing in writing. He says, we're going to make it work. And so the next day, I come out on the back porch, and Mike is standing there in the backyard. Just this little 10 by 20 foot space, just 3 meters by 6, something like that. And he has his head down. He says, Jon, I can't do it. I said, can't do what? He said, I gave them my word. I gave them my word that they could have this house a couple months from now. I can't go back on my word. And I said to him, Mike, you're a lawyer. And you said, I can't go back on my word. I says, Mike, you are the voice of God to me today. Because God is using you to say, if this lawyer can't fix this problem, it's not fixable. You see? And I'd already talked to the conference president and said, could I stay? And he says, oh man, best news I've heard all day. You want to stay? No problem. We'd love to have you stay. So it was all kind of working out until my lawyer friend said, sorry, And I said, I'm not going to move within New York City just to stay. I said, let's go in faith
Yes.
and just do this thing. So we made the commitment. Yes, she's not going to work while I'm in the doctoral program. I'm not going to be having a regular salary. We saved up some money, but it's certainly not enough to live on for the next 3-4 years. We just went in faith. And here's the amazing thing. A couple days after this, not knowing any of this, a dear friend of mine, Al Coley, came up to me. And he was a businessman in New York City. And he had been like a co-pastor with me, a lay pastor. He would go visiting with me. Great guy, absolutely wonderful guy. And he says, you're going to be gone there. Andrew's getting that doctorate. He says, I would like to put you on retainer. I said, what does that mean? He says, well, I'll give you $300 a month. And then when I have a need, I'll have you write documents for me or, help me with advice and things like that you'll be like my advisor and stuff. I'm kind of like,
Consultancy.
whoa, amazing. That was a token that we're going to be okay. I hardly had gotten to the seminary when one of the teachers there comes up to me and says, I'm on a general conference committee on secularism. And we're trying to figure out how the church can engage the secular world. We got this whole long list of books, and none of us has time to read them. He says, I'm proposing that you read those books and write a report on them for us, and we'll pay you thus and such amount of money. And I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, I can do that. And
Sounds
by the
like,
way, that's how I got into this whole thing of reaching secular people, is because the General Conference asked me to read a bunch of books on them, and it got me started. And then I combined that with my New York City experience, and it went straight from there. So uh, shortly after that, the head of the department where I was studying came up to me and said, we had a faculty member who went to Australia for a special project for several years, and he's supposed to come back next fall, but he can't. And he can't come back. He says, so I need somebody to take his classes next fall. Could you do that? And I said, sure. He says, and we'll make sure it's worth your time. Well, every quarter he came to me and said, he's not coming back yet. Can you do another quarter? And this went for 2 years, you see. So financially, God took care of us. And, I was doing a little work there as well. And in the library, but, 20 hours a week or something like that. But with all these sources of income, my wife never had to work after we had the baby. And there's more stories I could tell, but the journey of faith there, that God is real. Okay, I know that God seems absent in the world to a lot of people, but in my experience, God is real, and things happen at times when you just wouldn't expect. Same thing happened, as I was coming to the middle of the doctoral program and beginning to run out of money. Okay, we're 3 years in now and running out of money. And then it was the idea that, maybe the seminary would hire me, And actually, there were 3 different departments, but finally, the theology department, Raul Dederin, one of God's precious saints, came up to me and says, I know you're in New Testament, but I think you can do theology, and I'd like to invite you. And New Testament ended up giving it to somebody else. And the library was another option. They gave it to somebody else. So that was the only one that opened up. And he says, I want a 10-year commitment from you
wow.
to stay in theology and not go back to New Testament. And I says, sure, this is where the possibilities are. And so we went. A year later, though, the seminary had a crisis, and there was a position in New Testament that they could not fill. It was a time of some theological tensions, etc., and there were political reasons they were struggling. And one of the theology professors called me in, and he said, and I know that you're the only person that New Testament and the dean can agree on. And I says, no, I'm not going there because I made my commitment. I gave my word.
My word.
Example, right? I gave my word 10 years in here. All right. I gave my word. I'm not going back on it now. And he said, I understand that. He says, but the dean needs to know that you're open, at least, you know. And so I said, all right. I can go in and say, you know, I'm committed to this, etc. But if the church feels this is where I need to be, you know, I wouldn't fight against it. And it was a traumatic experience because my good friend in theology felt betrayed, and I've always felt badly about that. But at the same time, the seminary needed it to happen. Even the general conference president was involved in that decision. And so I was obedient to the larger church to move against the personal commitment I had made. So that was almost like a dark night in a way. But I thought that being in New Testament, being a teacher at the seminary, that was my ultimate goal. That's what I thought was the spiritual pinnacle. And I found out it wasn't as satisfying as I expected. And another thing that happened, you know, the students were not always as serious as I thought they should be. So my dreams of this perfect location, when I finally reached the place, you know, before that I could say, well, I'm not an expert in theology, so the challenges I'm having is because I'm, you know, not in the ideal place yet. Get to the ideal place, and still there are challenges. And in 1986, I got my first invitation to speak at a camp meeting. And from that time on, speaking appointments started pouring in. So another challenge was, how do you manage a family? At the same time, you're managing this worldwide ministry that has opened up before you. Most of the time, these public speakings were a great joy to me, but balancing travel and family, and I take my hat off to my mom and dad who often pitched in and helped beyond the call of duty during that time. So anyway, this is sort of leading up to the dark night of the soul. None of these qualify, I think, as dark night of the soul, but God was humbling me all the way through. That whenever I was settled in the idea that I've made it, you know, I'm spiritually successful, I'm here where I need to be. Every time I reached that kind of a place, God, humbled me and brought me to another place. So that's what we can go to next time. The dark night of the soul, what precipitated it, and where it led.
You just set the stage, and I can't wait to hear the end of the story.